Okay, it is 10:15. Let's begin. Hi, hello, and very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Rajiv Rajani. I'm the CTO of iSHARE Foundation, and I'm going to explain to you today what is iSHARE all about. Um, and of course, I'll introduce to the concepts of data spaces and how iFortrust helps you in getting started with data spaces. So let's begin. Um, what do these images on the screen remind you of subconsciously? Right? You see, it's basically trust. We use trust every day. We need trust every day. We rely on so many services which are operated or by so many different people. We completely rely on them for our day-to-day life. Um, and it is enabled by implicitly having trust in them that they will do their job right, and that will make sure that we reach to our destination, for example, or we get certain services and things like that. So trust is the underlying uh, key element which enables shared services, right? Basically building on other people. So when there are more people working on something, yeah, you can make impossible things possible. But in today's world, can we say the same thing about data online or with our business data? um, because our businesses depend on the data. We are all digital now. Our businesses run on data. um, are we sure enough that it is all secure, and especially when we are sharing data with our partners and vendors, um, uh, are we sure that they are using the data in the right spirit, and according to the conditions that you agreed on, basically? Well, which leads for us now today to um, uh, entering into a lot of bilateral contracts between the organizations with whom we directly deal with, right? Essentially, every time you buy a SaaS service from a cloud provider, for example, or you are striking a deal with your subcontractor or vendor or a partner, basically you enter into a paper-based agreement where you determine all the clauses, um, which determines what data can be shared between the two organizations, how the data is handled, and a lot of those things, right? Which of course is a very time consuming process, because both sides, the legal teams, have to be sure of what is included, and you have to make sure that your contracts are good enough that it doesn't lead you into any troubles and whatnot, right? But what if we could say that instead of doing that every time with every party you want to share data with, we can build on a digitally verifiable trust anchor, which allows you to reduce this bilateral contractual thing to the bare minimum, and most of it can be digitally done, right? And that way, use that as a foundation for authorizations that you provide to other organizations, dynamically and digitally share uh, data, the conditions, um, and also make sure that it is verifiable and controllable and traceable on the other end. Introducing to you what is iShare framework, which is essentially what this is all about. It basically allows you to get rid of the bilateral agreements that you make with other organizations, um, and you can start interacting with other organizations by digitally giving them access rights and usage conditions, basically. But let's see how let's get into the details. So iShare is a trust framework which enables which is basically data agnostic, which enables sharing of data of any kind of nature. It is federated, so it's not a central organization which is controlling anything. It's all completely federated structure. It allows you for distributed data sharing or decentralized data sharing, basically. So you don't need to copy over all your data to certain platform, for example, to in order to share that data with other participants. um, but it's You can share the data directly from the source. iShare is a not-for-profit initiative. So iShare Foundation is set up for that and for maintaining the trust framework. And it's a not-for-profit organization, so there is no profit motive. And it's universal in the sense that the framework is completely international and generic. So it can be applied internationally in any sectors, any regions that you want. The same principle will still work, right? Which essentially enables or brings to you the data sovereignty. As a data owner, you remain in control of the data after you have shared, by sharing the data with right people under the right conditions. And it also brings the necessary trust in order to share the data, because as we just saw, without trust you essentially will never think of sharing data, right? So iShare framework brings the data sovereignty and trust in sharing of data and in data spaces. Few facts about iShare Trust Framework. It's live since 2018, with data over 1.5 million businesses being shared using this framework. It is trusted by governments, so governments organizations are also adopting the framework for exchanging of data. It's growing very rapidly because governments and other organizations are adopting it. um, yeah, and of course it is compliant with the architecture of GAIX and IDSA, which are trying to do similar things, but basically iShare complements or completes those architectures in terms of the trust framework elements. A brief history of iShare. iShare was actually co-created by the market for the market. So it is not one organization who created it, but it was a co-creation process. So preparation already began in 16, and the working groups were created, which together discussed all the elements of iShare framework, and they were all documented and uh, discussed and documented what was required for the market. And in 2018, the first version of iShare framework was live and implemented by the initial participants. At the same time, the iShare Foundation was being created, and in 2019, iShare Foundation completely took over the responsibility of managing the iShare framework um, document. And since then it has been operating the framework and responsible for adoption of iShare framework, and explaining to other participants what benefits it brings when it is implemented, how the trust framework um, allows you to share data and reduce the bilateral agreements that you enter into. So iShare has some guiding principles. Basically, first is the generic building block to enable data exchange. So this is one of the key guiding principles of iShare, that we always wanted to make sure that this iShare framework acts as a basic building block or generic building block, which enables data exchange, right? So since it is a generic building block, it is designed such that it is always generic and can apply in different sectors and internationally as well. Limited scope. So we defined what was MVP in that sense, what was minimum required for in order to start sharing of data. And we thought, okay, it's the first step in any kind of data sharing is, you first need to identify and authenticate with whom you are interacting with, and you have to check for the authorization, whether that party has the right authorization to that data set or not. and then actual transfer happens after you have determined these things. So iShare scope is limited to identification, authentication, authorization as in terms of specifications, but its scope as in the legal coverage is throughout. So because everything is determined in identification, authentication, and authorization on that data set, all elements related to that exchange is covered by that aspect, and that is what we saw as the minimum thing that we require in order for any data exchange to happen. So we limited our scope to identification, authentication, and authorization, right? um, and of course we don't want to reinvent the wheel when there are already wheels invented by working wheels invented by a lot of international organizations. So we leverage existing open standards like OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, PKI infrastructure, EIDAS framework, to just name a few. Using this as an existing building blocks, we leverage those. But of course, we find that these standards by itself are not sufficient in terms of B2B or G2B or government to government organization data exchange. So we have some adaptations made to those standards when you are implementing it under iShare. But we'll see that more later. Um, Most important, the framework itself is very agnostic to the nature or content of data. So data exchange can happen using any mechanism, any standard. The data model can be anything. It can be a standard data model. It can be a proprietary data. It doesn't matter. So when it comes to data, it's completely between the two participants how they exchange the data, with which mode of transport, what is the format of it, and what models they use for it. Um, uh, iShare framework does not dictate specific uh, requirements for sharing of that data standard, right? Another key principle is always benefits outweighs investment for all types of participants. That is essentially because it was a market co-creation. It often happens that when there are larger players involved, that they influence a lot because they bring in a lot of investment from their perspective, which has potential to influence it in their favor. But iShare has always been neutral in that sense, and it has made sure that irrespective of the size of the organization and the investment that particular organization makes, everyone is heard about, everyone's opinion is taken into consideration before designing any kind of solution or updating anything in the framework, right? You'll learn more about it because iShare is governed also by the participants of iShare, and each participant has equal right in terms of how the framework is defined, irrespective of the size and location or whatever details of that participant, right? So that's our guiding principle. Um, Another key principle that we always kept in mind while designing everything on the framework was that it has to be international ready. So of course we start in one location with one market, one sector, for example, because that's more pragmatic way to start. Uh, but of course, we always had the vision that this framework has to be international and generic, that it can be applied internationally as well as in any sectors. Another important aspect that it enables is that the role model is defined such that it enables federation of services. So, which basically means that participants are not logged into specific platforms or service providers, but because of the federated nature of each role, they are always uh, easy for them to move from one provider to another because they all follow the same standard. So it's portability is achieved, and roles are federated so that multiple players can play the same role, right? In all, the result is basically iShare is foundation of. So we cover a few key aspects. That is the business aspect for to start with. That iShare framework forms the basis for business data exchange, allowing businesses to share data in sovereign manner. So what is in for business? Then it is this basically. It allows businesses and governments, basically any kind of organization, to share data in sovereign manner, so they remain in control of the data that they share. um, Legal part is basically, as I explained, that it is a basic multilateral legal framework which enables you to exchange data with other participants, and avoid getting into bilateral contracts every time you want to share data with any other party, right? Operational, of course, there are some essential services that are needed for participants to start sharing data. More we'll see later. But iShare already defined some basic operational requirements that these organizations or participants of iShare should fulfill in order to make sure that you can rely on the services which are essential for your data sharing, right? Uh, of course, the key aspect is your use case, which is basically your functionality and the technical implementation of that functionality. And iShare, as I said initially, the scope of iShare specification is limited to identification, authentication, authorization. So it does have specifications for that, which are basically based on the open standards, as I mentioned earlier, OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, PKI infrastructure, and whatnot. Um, and these specifications are designed in mind, or designed such that it covers they are the basis on which covers you on the legal aspects, on the operational aspects, and on the business aspects, right? And these are the specifications which we think are very basic and most needed, or minimally needed in order to enable any kind of data exchange. So using these specifications, your first step is covered, and you only focus on the main step, that is what data to exchange, how to exchange with the other participant, basically. So business and organizational aspects of this framework are basically allows you, or the roles, the parties involved in the exchange of data. So of course, when there is an exchange, there is a provider and there is a consumer, and there is also owner, or the entitled party who has the rights to the data. And these aspects are basically covered under the framework, such that um, these participants, when they use this framework, they uh, they can share data with each other with full confidence, and the entitled party or the data owner can digitally share and manage the rights to the data that it wants to share with the consumer. Um, Framework, iShare framework is, as I mentioned, multilateral agreement, because when the participants on board via the satellites in iShare, they actually sign a legal agreement where they accept the terms of use and accession agreement, which determines that uh, they accept that they will abide by the rules and the data licenses, for example, that are shared along with the authorizations on the data. So they, on one hand, they accept on the legal aspects of the framework, and on other hand, they also accept that they will make sure that they are always technically compatible in the role that they are playing, so that they remain interoperable with other participants. Another, yeah, of course, the key aspect of how we enable the data sovereignty is the licenses, the data licenses, as we call it in iShare, which enables which brings the trust and gives the control to the entitled party, that it can remain or it can dictate what the usage rights on that data set is, right? So I, as a data owner, I want to say specify that you, as a recipient of my data, a particular data set XYZ, may only make use of this data, say for 1 month, and may not share it with others. That is my usage condition for you. Only when you accept that condition, you should accept the data and process it. Um, and you will do that because, on one hand, you have legally signed that you will abide by the terms of use. And when I provide this data license along with the authorization to you, you first have to make sure that you, as a recipient of that data, can handle this data according to the licenses. If not, of course, then you are liable in case of misuse of that usage policy, right? So, and because you have legally signed that information and there is a digital trail of the proof that you received the data and you did not stick to the usage rights or usage policy associated with that data set. I, as a data owner, I have uh, legal basis to hold you in contempt in court of law, basically. So that is what gives the data owners the confidence and the data sovereignty. As I mentioned, operational aspects, there are few key essential services within iShare framework which are provided by different organizations. But because these are so vital for uh, uh, any kind of use case to be supported by all the participants, there are some availability and SLA requirements that are already set for these organizations as a basis. Of course, in data space, these uh, agreements or aspects could be adopted, or they can be changed to better suit the requirements of that data space. We'll see more on that later. And these organizations which play these roles also have additional agreements which they need to sign apart from the basic terms of use and accession agreement under the framework. And these agreements basically cover the elements on the operational requirements and additional other requirements. Uh, more on the technical and functional aspects. So as I mentioned already, that iShare already specifies the specifications for identification, authentication, and authorization for each role, which basically allows you to discover each other and identify and authenticate each other and authorize each other in a very standard way and interoperable way. Um, the implementation of the specification itself is agnostic to any technology stack, so you can use any technology stack you prefer, because these are just API specifications. And you can of course use them to build new integrations with new partners, or you can update your existing integrations with existing partners to start using this mechanism for identification, authentication, authorization. More importantly, these specifications allows peer-to-peer data exchange, basically. So you can enable sharing of data from the source directly to the end consumer, and that is achieved by two key aspects. Basically, one, that participants are trusted in the network, so you can also find which participants are already agreed to iShare terms of use, um, and based on which you can be sure that this participant will abide by the rules of the framework on one hand, and on other hand, there is a standard way to do the identification and authentication. So when that participant wants to connect to you, you know exactly how that participant connects to you, what kind of request it will send, and how you can process and authenticate, so that you can trust that it is indeed the participant who is trying to connect to you, right? um, and of course, it enables the federation of essential services. So essential services are not tied to one or two organizations which are provided in the network, but these are defined as roles. So any provider can implement those specifications and meet the requirements to play those roles, and they can start providing that as a service to other participants. More we will see later. So let me introduce to you the iShare role model, because I already showed you some elements of the role model, but let me introduce them now in completion. So we basically have, on one hand, of course, the service consumer. A service consumer is basically the consumer of the data. For example, service provider is the one who is providing the service or the data, and this is usually on behalf of the entitled party or the data owner. So usually it happens that organization itself is the data owner, but it uses like cloud SaaS products, or another IT providers who basically manages and hosts their application in the database, and they act as the data provider in that sense. Sometimes the organization itself is both the owner as well as the provider, because it has its own IT systems operated, right? Then we have the iShare satellite. iShare satellite is basically one of the essential service role, which is basically which enables the trust in the whole network, right? Um, uh, the satellite is basically where participants register themselves to be part of this network. So it acts as a like a directory or the registry of participants, where you can find all the details about other participants. More details will follow. And of course, the identity provider. So iShare framework covers both machine to machine and human to machine interaction. So when there are humans involved, humans can be employees, or it can be partners, vendors, any human element which is involved. And when it is interacting, we need identity of that human to that organization, so that they can the data exchange can happen basically based on the trusted identity. And authorization registry, which is basically where the entitled party stores all the policies for consumer to have access to certain data sets from the provider, right? Let's take a deep dive in each of the role. Service consumer, as I said, service consumer is usually the data consumer in general context. It needs most of the time it needs data in order to do its business, or it sometimes provides some updates to the data as a result of certain action that it performs. A good example is like say if there is a package to be picked up from warehouse for a company, and company assigns that task to a transport company which operates the trucks, then the transport company is basically the data consumer. So when it before picking up the container or the product from the warehouse, it needs to get the data about the ETA and the schedule, say for example, of when that product can be picked up from the warehouse, because warehouse has certain operational processes in place, and it needs to know when it can go and pick up the product from the warehouse. Once it has picked up, probably it also wants to update ETA on when it will be delivered to certain address, where destination basically. So then it is also providing the data, but it is essentially providing the service in that sense to the owner of the product, physical product. But it is just either consuming or sending the data at certain service endpoints where this information makes more sense. um, Data owner usually give rights to the service consumer basically, so that it can get access to the data source directly, or it can get access to the service directly, where it can read or write the data. And as I already mentioned, it can be a machine of that transport company, or it can be a human who is updating that information. Uh, in case of human, of course, it needs to be identified by an identity provider. Uh, and it is the service consumer who always abides by the data license, because it received the data license along with the authorization that it received on the data set, which determines what the usage policy of the data is, right? So as a consumer of that data, you make sure that you abide by that license before actually using that data. Next in line, of course, is the service provider. The service provider is basically, or usually, the data provider. It's like an IT provider, or a cloud SaaS provider, data lakes, data hubs, whatnot. It can be any organization, right, providing, who is basically having the data. Um, and this organization can be just an IT provider to an organization, or it can be the organization itself. Large organizations tends to have their own IT in house, so then they itself act as data provider, right? So data provider is the place that consumer or service consumer will directly interact with, and get the data or exchange the data. iShare specifies the API specification for identification, authentication, and authorization for service provider or data provider, uh, to when they are exposing the data services, right? So for that, the IAM specifications are provided under iShare, and these providers need to implement those in order to exchange data using iShare framework. Um, as I mentioned, the iShare specifies or reuses the existing standards like OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect. But of course, these standards were actually built for B2C, specifically in the internet world. And it cannot, as is, operate in the business to business or government to business worlds, right? So we had to adopt it to make it more in line with how, uh, to better suit it for the business to business or business to government interactions. So this all, um, it provides a certain level of assurance for organizations which are involved in the transaction, which enables them to exchange the data in a trusted manner. And it is also in line with verifiable credential principles. So basically, because we use PKI for identification, or in most cases, and PKI is basically digital certificates issued to you by authorities. And you use that credentials to sign further claims that you make. So it is in that sense in line with verifiable credentials. The next role, the entitled party. We don't call data owner specifically, because data owner uh, is a very difficult term to define. Most of you probably already know that. So we call it as entitled party. Entitled party is basically a party who is the data owner at a given time and context of that data. What essentially it means is that it is a party who has the first right on that particular data set, right? uh, and it can determine what can be done with that data. So it is a party who has that right to that data, basically, at a given time. Um, it can it cannot necessarily be that it is the one who generates that data, because it can be another party who generates it for another organization, for example. But then the entitled party remains for whom it was created. That is an example of it, right? And how does so entitled party is basically who wants to retain the sovereign control over its data. And it uses authorization registry to specify who should have access to data and under which conditions. And for that, it uses the data license. Data licenses basically to determine what usage conditions apply to certain data sets when it is being given as an authorization to another data consumer. Then iShare Satellite. iShare satellite acts as a trust anchor in the data space, or it's the key essential role in the framework. It is it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a registry of participants. So when any participant wants to join iShare framework or use iShare framework, they register themselves via satellite, and they onboard themselves via satellite. So they need to meet certain requirement in order to be registered in the satellite. That is basically, first of all, they need to determine what role they play within this role model. They need to implement the specifications for that role which they are playing. They need to buy an EIDAS certificate, and then they can register at the satellite. So that there is an onboarding process they need to go through. It also acts as a basic discovery point for participants, data services, roles, authorization, registry, etc. So, as it is a list of participants, right? So, it's not only just giving you the name of the participant or ID of the participant which is registered, but it also gives some additional essential information like, okay, where can you find data endpoints of this participant, for example. That is called capabilities endpoint and iShare. What role this participant play. So when you get the details of this participant, along with that you also get what roles are registered for this participant. uh, where do they host, or where do they store their authorizations? So there are authorization registry URLs. So if you want to check if this party has given rights to another party, you can query on their authorization registry, basically. And further details like which data space it belongs to and whatnot. So some basic elements of that participant are already provided to you as from the satellite. iShare satellite also usually is expected to play the role of the governing body of the data space. So more about it when we talk about data spaces and the governance around it. Um, it registers participants, as I mentioned, but they are in compliance with the iShare framework, so that you can trust the participants who are registered in the satellite, which establishes the trust in order to exchange data in first place. And important is that, as I mentioned, the data exchange actually happens peer to peer. So satellite is not the party in between of that exchange. It is only involved in the initial authentication part. So when party A connects to party B, and you want to verify if party A is known in the network and registered in the network, at that time you check it with the satellite that this party is known in the network. But once that is done, you don't go back to satellite, and the actual data exchange happens between party A and B, right? Then another role is the authorization registry. So authorization registry role is usually an role played by IT providers, or it is service providers, basically, to the data owners. A data owner can also choose to implement its own specification of this role, but then only when it wants to use it for its own purposes, right? But usually they are provided by service providers. The important thing to note is authorization registry specification in iShare only specifies the API endpoint, and it is completely agnostic of how the authorization registry functionality itself is implemented. That essentially means that there is iShare framework does not define which standard to use for storing policy. For example, it can be SAML, XML, ORDL, or any other such standard to store the policies. Or it can even be not policies but actual transactional data, for example, from your backend systems, or your existing LDAP, AD, other directories which already stores authorizations for certain users in terms of role-based access today that is more commonly used everywhere. But with iShare, of course, you move to the attribute-based access, but then the authorization registry is responsible for making sure that it translates what that role means in terms of certain attributes, whether those attributes can be accessed or not based on the role assigned to that user, for example. So these all elements are open for authorization registries to implement. However, iSHARE specifies the endpoint through which the service provider can query an authorization registry on whether a particular consumer has access to a particular data set or not. Right? So that interface is standardized. That is to make sure that irrespective of any authorization registry provider that is playing the role, uh, it is always compatible with all the participants of iShare network. Right? It is up to the data owner to choose its own provider of its liking. As I earlier mentioned, these are federated roles, so data owner can always choose. Um, uh, it can select an authorization registry today, and it can move over to another one. It is basically not logged in because towards iShare, the interface is towards the other participant. The interface is very standard. And as an authorization registry or for parties who want to play this role, it is your responsibility to make it easier for data owners or business users to create either policies or define rules, business rules, to determine how the authorizations can be determined. Right. So that is the expectation from this role. The next role in the framework is the identity provider. Um, so identity provider, as I mentioned, is essential for including the human elements in the transactions, right? So one aspect is your two machines or two servers are talking, and then it is purely automated thing, and there is no need of identity provider. I'll explain later why in iServer a framework, two machines can be identified without an identity provider. Um, but for humans, of course, you need uh, an identity provider who has onboarded that identity of that employee, and that employee, when it logs in, this identity provider can provide the authenticity of that identity, which is important for usually the business transactions or organizational data exchange. So, as I mentioned, the identities can be employees, partners, contractors of any organization, basically. Uh, but key element is that it is human identity provider in iShare, and not a general identity provider, as in which provides identity for everything. Right. Identity providers level of assurance is determined following the EIDAS framework. So iShare uses EIDAS framework basically for also while onboarding every type of participants. Um, uh, but of course, EIDAS also specifies additional uh, elements for an identity provider, and iShare reuses those elements basically, which determines also the level of assurance of this organization. So it allows from startup to large identity provider organizations all to play the role in iShare. And depending on your use case, you can choose which identity providers are suitable for your use case. Yeah, and iShare, of course, specifies the APIs for identity provider, which are based on OpenID Connect, which is again modified to suit the requirements for federation on one hand, and on other hand, B2B and G2B and G2G kind of interactions. So all in all, to sum it up a bit, iShare supports a key set of functionalities. So it enables two kinds of interaction: machine to machine and human to machine, which basically should cover all kind of use cases. Uh, it facilitates flexible authorizations. So um, uh, the API or interface of authorization registry is such that um, it allows you to ask very specific question or very broad question, and the authorization registry can accordingly respond to you, basically, in terms of which attributes uh, a particular identity has access to, for example. And it can be very very specific, like uh, to a very specific attribute, or it can be very broad, like the whole set of attributes, it doesn't matter, and it can do like every action it possible on that attribute. um, of course, the complete flexibility is given in terms of how and where to store the authorizations. So it is on the data owner how they store it, where they store it, whether they sorry, whether they store it as policy, or whether they use transactional data, for example. So very very flexible structure in terms of authorization. Portable identities, again, as I mentioned, the identity providers, because they are played by different organizations, um, it's the organization can always switch between identity providers, so they can switch from one provider to another. Irrespective of that, they can still continue to use the identity provider of their choosing with this framework, because they are all compliant and registered identity providers in the network. Um, what all this enables is basically delegation of the rights. So, as a data owner or entitled party, I can delegate my rights, and I can also control the further delegation down the line. So, for example, it's not only like I, as a entitled party, only give rights to the consumer, but I can also give rights to party A, which in turn can delegate its rights to party B, in turn, which can delegate its rights to party C, for example. So delegation is also something that's possible and covered under the specification of the authorization registry. And and of course, the customer in control, or basically the data owner or entitled party, completely controls what can happen with the data by determining the first, who has access to that data, second, whether that party can delegate it further down the line, for example, and how many times it can delegate. So you can also control how deep it can go in terms of delegation of rights. And of course, it also specifies the data licenses, uh, which allows them to determine or dictate the usage on the consumer that it needs to abide by when it is using that data. So it gives complete control to the data owner. And now I'm going to briefly introduce to you the concept of the data space. So what is a data space? Data space is a decentralized data ecosystem built by parties with common purpose, right? So it's a space where organizations come together and they agree on common sets of agreements, or they agree on how they will which standards they will use, which are a kind of data that they want to share within the confines of this data space. What are the rules that different roles of these participants of data space needs to abide by, and things like that, right? So together they come and make a data space. But what how do you start? I mean, you can how do you start to create a data space? So here I present to you a very basic template on of creation of data space, or what we think is basically the bare minimum, right? So on the top you see the yellow icons, which are basically the data consumers and the data providers. The very purpose of building the data space is because there are parties who want to exchange data, right? And these are the exchangers, basically. So data provider and data consumer, they share data with each other. In the middle, you see the data space governance. Of course, when you have a set of organizations and you have defined certain rules, you of course need governance and the trust elements around it in order to make sure that things remain operational. And not only operational, but they are also updated to remain relevant, because we know technology keep on changing, and there is always new things or new regulations, for example, that keep on coming, which you need to adopt to. So governance is very key in terms of making sure that the data space remains operational, and on the other hand, it remains relevant to all its participants. And on the bottom layer, you see the key service provider or essential service providers, basically the identity provider and authorization registry, um, as well as services like marketplace and other vocabulary provider and whatnot. So these are essential service providers that enable the the top layer to exchange data, right? So um, in iShare, as you can see, iShare role model already defines these roles. And in data space, basically every data space has the same set of roles. Um, and but of course, then what we want to avoid is to create silos, because as a data space, you can maybe you are happy that you are able to interact with each other, but soon you will realize that your use case is not complete when until you exchange data with other party who are in another data space, for example. So what you basically need is interoperable data spaces, where on one hand you are a part of one data space, sharing some data service, data exchanging data with other participants, whereas on the other part of that use case, you need to exchange data with another participant in another data space. So you should remain interoperable with all of them. And in I for Trust, of course, iShare and Fiverr brings all the necessary components that are needed to get started with data space. But more we'll see later. Um, Data spaces, of course, they need to be built around real businesses. It's not a vague concept, but it's actual reality, uh, which basically, in terms of businesses, you need to agree on certain elements like the interoperability, the sovereignty, the value creation, and the governance. And within sectors or within verticals or within certain domains, basically, however you want to call it, where there is a real potential on exchange of data, which should create value for the participants that are involved, right? Uh, and value is in it is not always generating money, but it can be bringing in efficiency or complying with the regulations or whatnot, because in the end, those all things give value to your businesses. So, introducing the 12 building blocks, we already saw this probably also in the previous session. But these are the basic building blocks of any data spaces, also as defined by OpenDive. I don't if you know about that initiative as well. But there are basically four verticals in this building blocks. One is the first, of course, is the data interoperability, which deals with all the elements related to how you exchange data, in what format, uh, using which transport, and whatnot, and also provide you with the provenance and the traceability aspects around that, so that you remain interoperable in terms of exchange of data. The second vertical is the data sovereignty and trust, which is the key element which allows you to enable uh, trusted exchange of data, because logically thinking, if you want to exchange data, it can be logically split into two sub steps. First is you want to before exchanging data, you always do an identification, authentication, and authorization. And once you have determined that, based on which authorizations you actually exchange the data or not, right? So that is the key element in order to start exchange of data. Data sovereignty and trust uh, are the key building blocks in order to exchange of data and uh, uh, to support your use case basically. Third vertical is data value creation, uh, which is about creating value out of the data that you have, right? And how do you create the value out of the data? How do you expose the data such that it is searchable and findable by other organizations, so that they can find what data sets you have, and probably because of their interest you are able to create value out of that data. So those elements are covered under this vertical. And last but not least is the data space governance. So the governance aspect, as I explained to you earlier, in any data space is very vital in order to make sure that the data space remains operational, and participants continue to abide by the rules and terms of use of a particular data space. This is just as I explained to you. Um, So iShare basically covers some of the key building blocks for creating of data spaces. As you can see on the screen, it covers the data sovereignty and trust. As I explained, iShare's focus has been on technical side on the identification, authentication, and authorization. So it does cover the identity management. It does cover the trusted exchange, because with the satellite as a trust anchor, you can find other participants of the data space with whom you can exchange data, and you know that these participants have also signed the same agreements as you have, which enables the trust in them, so that you can exchange the data and you are sure that they will abide by the licenses, data licenses that are attached to the data sets. Access and usage control policies, of course, the authorization registry role as defined in iShare allows the data owners or entitled parties to manage the access and usage control policies. Um, Data value creation, one of the key elements in data value creation is discovery of the metadata. And to some extent, as I explained, when a participant, you get the details of participant from satellite, you also get additional details about the metadata or about the services where it are hosted and things like that. So to certain extent, this element is also covered. And of course, on the governance aspect, because framework is itself also has its own governance, but it also has the legal aspects, which form the part of the business agreements, and there are certain operational requirements for all kind of roles, which form the part of our operational agreements. So you can use that as a starting basis for your data space, and add additional requirements if necessary, in your data space for relating to these blocks. And of course, the organizational agreements are between the organizations of the data space, so it is always data space specific. um, I'll also go a bit deeper in these two verticals where iShare framework covers them, and how they are covered. So how iShare fits in those building blocks basically. So data sovereignty and trust, basically, as explained, the principles, because of the identification, authentication, authorization elements that are defined in iShare, um, that brings the data sovereignty and the trust principles in any data space. Now, key element as in for bringing data sovereignty and then the trust is basically the trust anchor, right, or the trusted exchange that is enabled. How that is enabled? So iShare is a foundation, which is also known, in terms of framework, it is known as the scheme owner, and it has uh, uh, a registry of participants which are basically done by the satellites. So satellites is basically based on a distributed ledger, right? So each satellite is a node in the same distributed ledger, and satellite is basically responsible for registering and certifying participants. So in any of the roles that we already saw, except for satellites. So Satellite cannot register another satellite, but satellite can register any other participant like data owner, data provider, data consumer, identity provider, authorization, registry, and etc. etc. Um, iSHARE Foundation, on one hand, registers data spaces, so it has a list of data spaces, and it also registers satellites within those data spaces. Because a satellite is the trust anchor of a data space, so you need to register a data space and the satellite who is the trust anchor within the data space. And that satellite, once it is registered by Foundation, the satellite organization just implements the node in the ledger, and then it can operate as a satellite which starts registering participants for that data space. This essentially is basically a very federated role, because participants don't need to come to iShare Foundation to be on board of iShare framework, but they um, go to their satellite. Basically, satellite is an organization known within their own sector. So, and it is very distributed in that sense. So it's the iShare satellite um, within your data space registers you as a participant, and as soon as you are registered by one satellite, you are immediately available in all other data spaces, because it is you are registered in a shared ledger, right? So that brings the interoperable trust element across the data spaces at a very basic level. So as I explained, this enables you, once you are registered in one satellite via one satellite in the framework, you are immediately discoverable in all the data spaces that are based on iShare framework. So this allows you to also not only interact with the participants of your own data space, but also interact with participants of other data spaces. Of course, for other data spaces, there might be some additional requirements which you may have to fulfill, but that is subject to how that data space is defined. And the link is basically iShare role model and data spaces role model. You can see there is a clear overlap in between these two. Both define the data exchange party. iShare additionally defines the entitled party role, who is basically allowing the access rights to be given to the data consumer for getting the data. The satellite plays the trust anchor role, and the identity provider and the authorization registry plays the essential roles which allow the data exchanging party to exchange data, right? Which of course enables different data spaces. For example, Dutch logistics, Belgian logistics, building sector, agri sector. These are just few of the data space examples, all using iShare framework as a basis. And of course, they are all interoperable in the sense of participants who can exchange data. And just an example to give you what are the possibilities. Of course, there are different examples or different possibilities as well. But this is like a cross value chain data sharing, which can bring in a lot of efficiencies, which we know in today's world is very inefficient process. Uh, a product which is produced in country X has to be transported to country Y, and sold via a retailer. But there are so many in between parties involved, and the currently there is no proper way to exchange data and no proper way to know which organizations can be trusted with what kind of data, right? So bringing that within the data spaces domain which are interoperable, you can bring a lot of value to this cross value chain and make this process much more efficient. And of course, in all, then iShare provides the trust validation of participants, because without trust, you cannot exchange data. So uh, participants are of uh, sure because they sign the contracts which covers the legal elements. uh, Data spaces specific legal agreements are also possible. So when you are defining a data space, you also add additional agreements within the data space, which are maintained by, of course, the data space and the satellite within the data space. Any participant who is onboarded to the network is done via so by the satellite, and the satellite is responsible for validating the participant's authenticity in first place before registering the participant. They are validated, of course, based on the rules defined in the framework, and the basic rules determine that you need to have uh, uh, the organizational verification done by checking the Chamber of Commerce registration, additional documents required for proving that that organization is exists. Currently, it's we require URI number, which can also be determined. It's not necessarily to apply for it, of course, um, unless you are, of course, outside EU organization. Um, uh, but we are also working on supporting more different kind of identifiers in within the iSHARE framework, so that you can reuse those identifiers which you already have. But based on this, a certain level of assurance of your organization is determined, which helps other participants to know what level of verification is done for the other participant, and based on that you can determine whether to share certain kind of data or not, for example. um, they are also additionally, of course, any participant who is registered, they also procure an PKI certificate. Currently it's EIDA certificate. Well, if you are within Europe, you can always buy EIDA certificate. Outside Europe, an equivalent kind of certificate is accepted. Uh, these kind of certificates are basically known as qualified seal certificates, and when you procure them, there is a certain level of validation that happens via the certificate authority, which brings already the level of trust that is needed, basic level of authenticity and the trust that is needed for registering any participant in the network. A brief on data value creation, as in iShare, what it covers basically, as I mentioned, the data pointers in the satellite for the from the participants for the data spaces. So when you query on a particular party of who participant who is registered via your satellite, you can see which data spaces that party is registered or operational in, right? So you can also see where which data spaces that participant is known, or well, it complies to, in that sense. It is known in all data spaces. um, and it also points to the data space definition URL. So when we say we register data spaces, we also register the data space definition of that uh, data space. And this definition basically describes which standards and uh, models and etc. are used by the participants of that data space. So this is a first step towards bringing interoperability between data spaces. So um, if you are able to read and understand the definition, and if you can um, meet those standards and requirements, you can immediately interoperate with the participants of that data space, for example. Additionally, details on the participant. It gives the single endpoint where a data participant can list all the endpoints that it exposes, which is basically the data endpoints, or it can refer to a marketplace where it has put all its offerings basically of the data sets. It also has um, uh, the pointer to the authorization registry. So as a data owner, where do I store my authorizations? So service providers can check uh, um, the authorizations from that authorization registry, for example. Of course, additional details of the participants are also optionally available, like the contact details and the company description and things like that, which can be used by data spaces to publish on the website, for example, or queried by another participant to know more about that organization, for example. Data space governance. This is one of the key blocks or key verticals in the data spaces, as I explained. And iSHARE framework provides you the basic foundation for it. So you can use this as a ready-made template. Um and again, re-emphasizing that governance in any data space is very essential, because it allows, on one hand, to make sure that your data space is operational, but at the same time also make sure that it is maintained and remains relevant for the participants of the organization. On top of it, of course, when you are talking about the interoperability between two data spaces, it can be at two data space level that they agree on how do they interact with each other or how do they interoperate with each other, because each data space has its own choices of standards and of, data models. They could essentially also agree on using common services, which makes them interoperable, for example. So these kind of possibilities are only possible when you have a proper governance in place, right? Um, iShare has its own governance model, and we provide this on what you see on the screen as a basic template, which you can use to get started with your data space governance structure. Of course, you are free to choose a structure which is more suitable for you. But if you are starting from scratch, maybe you want to see if this fits for you and is workable for you. What it essentially explains is, basically, on the left you see the satellite, which acts as the governing body, who is responsible for, on one hand, of course, registering the participant, but also um, uh, uh, adoption of the data space. So it is sort of as acts as a also a marketing or responsible party who promotes the data space within the sector or within the target group of the data space. And of course, the data space standard management, as I explained to you, that when you define, you also have a definition of your data space, which defines standards, the data models, etc., that are used by your data space. And you keep on maintaining it to make sure that it is up to date, relevant for all the participants that are part of the data space. So this is basically on the operational aspect of the data space, coming under the satellite, for example. And on the right you see the participants, basically, who are governing the operational aspects, right? So on the top, you see optionally you can have a supervisory board to supervise the operations of the satellite, right? Which of course is appointed by the council of participants and possibly council of sponsors, depending on your data space structure. Of course, you have the participants, so you have the council of participants. Additionally, if you have sponsors in your data space, you can also have council of sponsors, which can be separate from participants in some cases. So this is of course optional, but you almost always have a participants or council of participants, basically, which is basically always advising the operational body in terms of, okay, what is relevant for them, because actual users are these participants, and they will remain in the data space till it makes sense to them, right? So they always advice to satellite or the governing body in terms of what should and how should the data space standard or be managed. They also appoint the change advisory board aspects. So you can see this letters here, LOFT. L stands for legal, O stands for operational, F stands for functional, T stands for technical, basically. And these boards are basically nothing but working groups, and the participants actually, since they are nominated people in each of these expertise areas, so they send legal experts, they send operational experts, they send functional experts, they send technical experts, which are basically your elements within your data space standard, basically. So like for example, when you are talking about which data model to use, or which standard to use, like JSON or XML, or do you want to use REST API, or you want to use EDI, for example. These are usually covered by functional and technical people from your organization, and they can determine what is best for the participants. So each participant sends their own representation, and together they make a decision which is commonly agreeable for all of them, for example. Legal and operational, on the other hand, when you have operational requirements for essential roles like satellite and authorization registry, these operational experts can determine what operational requirements they need from them in order to make sure that the use cases and business cases remain operational, for example. Similarly, for legal, any legal aspects surrounding your data space, how do you tackle them? Uh, how do you define clauses for, or how do you define your data space specific agreements that each participant has to abide by and or sign before they join or after they have joined, for example. And also taking care of new regulations that affect your data space, for example. Yeah. So this is an example template which we provide to all data spaces when they want to set up the governance of their data space. Um, this is basically what I just explained. And on the left, you can see a screenshot where we, as a foundation, we register a data space and what details of a data space we register. Basically, it's the name and title, the definition URL, the details about the data space, like if it has a website, which country it operates in, which sector it operates in, and if it has specific agreements that it needs its participant to join. Um, but how does this all fit within iShare framework, and how does because iShare framework also has its own governance, and when you are registered as a data space which is based on iShare framework, you are also part. You also make part of that framework or governance, right? So I'll explain also on the iShare part. The iShare iShare Foundation is basically the operational and the strategic part of the iShare framework. So iShare Foundation is also acts as a scheme owner, and it has an executive board which is responsible for maintaining the framework and keeping it operational. So it makes sure that trust is governed. So the trust element within the network is maintained at a level. It is also responsible for marketing of iShare, and of course managing the framework itself, right? We have a supervisory board which supervises all the actions that are done by the executive board of iShare Foundation. And this supervisory board is basically appointed by our council of participants as well as council of sponsors. So we have both, of course. There are participants in iShare today already, and we also have sponsors. So they together appoint the members of the supervisory board, who in turn supervises us. But they not only do that, but they also advise us on strategic matters, or in terms of how they see their business is going, and how iShare framework can be made more relevant to them. So we take advice from them, and we bring additional changes to the framework or the standard based on that. Right? And of course, as explained earlier, we also have the change advisory board representing legal, operational, functional, and technical aspects. And this change advisory board also comes from the participants. But with data spaces, of course, the council of participants are now the council. They are representation from the council of participants of the data space. So each data space sends their own nominations or own representatives of participants, and their change advisory board members are also part of our change advisory board, so they can directly influence or contribute to the iShare framework. So when you set up a data space based on iShare framework, of course you have your own governance, but you also send your representatives to the larger group, basically at the foundation level, and there as well you have your say in terms of how the future of the iShare framework should be developed or what additional requirements you need to fulfill, so that the framework can be adopted and kept relevant for all the data spaces in that sense, right? Um, iShare Foundation regularly holds change advisory board sessions and council of participant sessions. So, change advisory board sessions, as I mentioned, are legal, operational, technical, functional. So, we discuss when there is a change request, we discuss the change and all the elements related to that change before adopting that change in the framework, and with the proper solution, which is designed with keeping the principles in mind of the iShare framework, making sure that it remains generic and neutral and it does not favor one participant over other participants. Council of participants, of course, learns about this and also provides strategic inputs in terms of how the future of the framework should look like. Uh, you being a participant, well, when you register yourself via satellite and be on board on iShare framework, you are automatically a participant, and you're always free to join any of this session, and also submit change requests if you feel necessary that certain element of the framework should be changed or updated to be made more relevant. Then you can submit a change request, and the change management procedure begins with that change, where a discussion, the change advisory board happens, um, about what possible solutions um, can we come up with for that change to accommodate that change. And based on the advice received from the change advisory board, an appropriate solution is chosen, uh, and then the change is implemented in the framework. Again, irrespective of the size, location, sector, data space, size, whatever, or participant size, it doesn't matter. Everyone has equal rights in terms of the table. So when you are in the table, your size, location, sector doesn't matter. Um, uh, you are an equal representative in the framework. So you can make suggestions, you can approve certain suggestions, reject certain suggestions. You can share what impact does it have in terms of you when certain changes implemented, and based on the impact analysis, further decisions is made whether to go ahead with the change or not, for example. um, and of course, similar processes for each data space governance can take place. So like in this your data space, you can also follow similar structure or similar processes to maintain the standard of the data space. But this is how the current governance of iShare looks like, and this is how we keep on updating our framework to remain relevant to all our participants, basically. Now, there was a lot of concepts and theory. um, I want to explain how iShare enables data exchange with an example. So, well, there are A few examples in front of us now. One is climate agreement reporting. So it's in the energy sector where the government wants to keep a tab on the energy consumption by the businesses, and it wants to promote energy efficient usage in the businesses so that carbon footprints can be reduced and the climate goal that we have can be achieved basically. So that's one example. The other example, of course, is prediction of arrival of goods. In spite of so much of technological advancements, we still struggle a lot in terms of estimated time of arrival of goods, when especially when it is uh, international transport, basically. So we'll see how iSHARE helps a lot of these participants in improving that process. Uh, of course, another example can be food value chain reporting. So this is basically concerning you when a farmer is growing certain crop, uh, from that moment till that crop is on your plate, basically, what all has happened to that crop. And you can trust that information because of this trust framework where each participant is trusted, and what information they share is true, right? But let's take one example, and that's this climate agreement, how this is achieved basically. So climate agreement reporting, there is a data owner. Data owner is basically the organizations like companies, businesses. Of course, you have offices, and you have energy consumption, and your government wants to know your energy consumption in your office basically, so that it can better determine what steps to take in order to meet the climate goals that we have, right? So in this case, the data owner is the business who has the property either owned or rented, it doesn't matter. And the data consumer is the government organization or unit, basically, which is responsible for collecting this kind of information. Now, the government checks with the satellite about this data owner to see where this data owner hosts the services, or where it can find this particular data set from this data owner. um, it it sees that, okay, this particular meter information or consumption information is stored with certain organization called EDSN. Basically, it's a grid operator which stores which can share the data on the consumption. So government directly goes to the operator to get the required data consumption of this organization data owner. Now, when it is asking, when the government unit is asking EDSN about the data, it first needs to identify itself, and at that time, EDSN checks, okay, who is asking for this data. It basically, the consumer presents a self-signed token in that sense, uh, and the EDSN validates that, and it also wants to check whether it is registered in iShare network, in order to make sure that when it shares the data, it will abide by the terms of use and the agreements that are made, right? So it checks with the satellite whether this participant is known in the network or not. Once it has determined that, of course, it can then see, okay, it is indeed an authenticated participant. It's an authentic participant, basically. Um, so it doesn't mind if it is asking for that data. But now, when the government unit is asking for the consumption data, it also needs to check if the data owner, that is the business whose consumption data it is, has allowed this unit or this consumer access to that data. And for that, it needs to check the authorization registry of that data owner. So it checks with the authorization registry, um, of the data owner whether the government unit can check for the consumption data of this user or not. Um, if such an authorization was not already provided, what can happen is that authorization registry can send a message to data owner asking that, okay, this government unit wants to get access to this data set. Do you agree? If so, do you want to create a policy for them, and for how long do you want to create that policy? What is the conditions for the usage, and etc. etc. So it can happen two way. Either data owner can already register such an authorization uh, beforehand, or the authorization registry, when it gets such a request, it can send a message to the data owner saying such and such organization was asking such and such data set. If you want, you can create a policy based on that, so that next time it asks for that data, it will get that data, right? So in this case, it was not pre-registered, so authorization registry sends a message to the data owner. Data owner says yes, because it is essentially obliged by the law that it needs to share such an information. So it makes such a policy in the authorization registry. So then next time when such a request comes, it automatically gets shared because there is an authorization policy in the authorization registry. Right. This is an example of how basic data sharing is happening between different organizations, as you can see. So what do you need in order to get started today with implementation of iShare and creation of your data space? Um well, what you can do is start with the existing business use case where at least more than one organization is involved, and use that as the starting point. So bring together some organizations with whom you can actually start your data space by determining what the use case could be, what the agreements would look like, and things like that. Start with very simple service, of course. You don't need to engineer everything in the one in the start, but you can start small by taking a very simple use case where you set you share a basic set of information with each other, uh, but then you define all the aspects around it, how you will share that data, what data model you will use, what would be the standard, um, and things like that. Of course, use already the iShare Trust framework so that you are covering many of the key elements of the data space building blocks already. So you don't need to reinvent those wheels. Basically, that is essentially my last point. Don't reinvent the wheel, but utilize existing open source components and open standards that we are using or we are referring to, and build your data space based on that. Yeah. Um, if to implement iShare framework, basically you can also find this three-step guide on our website. All you need to do is step one: identify your role and the data space you wish to join or create, of course. So if you can also find a data space to join, or you can find a data, or you can create your own data space if you are a group of participants. But then, of course, first step will be to identify your role, what role you will play within the role model. Second step, make sure you comply with the requirements of that role by implementing the specifications and everything. So iShare also provides a test network where you can request for test dummy certificates to play the roles in your test environment, and you can actually develop and try out things in your test environment before going to the production, right? So, and you can also in that test network interact with other organizations if you want to, or you can also do a role play. So if you are a if you are a single organization and you want to see how you can interact with other organization in other role, you can also play the role of it. There are some components available where you can do the role play of the other organizations as well. And of course, last but not least, when you are all done and uh, your use case is your proof of concept is ready in your test environment, basically you can move to the production by completing all the formalities that is needed, basically. And then uh, you can start sharing data with all the participants of iShare. Of course, you can get in touch with us to get more details about iShare. And you can find some links where you can find additional details on iShare. Um Today, I'm not going to cover the technical specifications. Those will be covered on Friday session. So if you want to get a deep dive in the technical session, make sure that you also join the Friday session where I will explain in detail. So I showed you an example, but I'll explain in detail what steps happen exactly, how the identification, authentication, authorization in machine to machine, human to machine, and all those aspects takes place. How those each role play that enable the exchange of data and everything, right? That was about iShare. I guess we can take a short quick break before continuing. Well, it's not very long now, but here I will explain how iShare and Fiverr bring the necessary components in iFortrust data spaces. I already introduced you to the data space concepts, but I also want to explain to you um, how it is all fitting in the iFortrust context, right? But we can take a short break of 10 minutes and reconvene at 12 o'clock.
Rajiv, perhaps before we go on a break, we can answer one of the questions that we have open, which
Yeah,
is
sure.
the iShare satellite is the role that the iShare satellite role is something that iShare offers, or does this need to be set up by one of the involved parties in the data space? And what's the software stack that one needs to install or provide?
Yeah, so good question. The role is something that one of the organizations need to play. The most ideal organization is an association of that sector, or similar body within that sector, um, who has a not for profit motive, basically. Those are ideal candidates for becoming a satellite. um, iShare satellite stack is basically, so as it's basically a distributed ledger based on Hyperledger Fabric, and we provide you with the deployment guide and register you in the network. Of course, it's a certified role, so you need to first apply for becoming a satellite, and there are certain requirements that you need to go through. But of course, you can find um, the deployment guide and the deployment scripts in on our GitHub of iShare already. So if you want to play around, you can already start playing around with it. Um, I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, and if it doesn't, we will be back after the break, right? And
Yeah.
then also, if there's any other open questions, we would like to invite people to put them in the chat so we can address them.
Yes. Hello and welcome back. I hope you had a quick short break. I promise I'll not take much of your time anymore. Let's just get started. So here, of course, I explained to you what iShare brings, what the framework looks like. Um, of course, feel free to post any questions you have or reach out to us if you need more details. But as I said, technical deep dive will happen on Friday. So also make sure that you join that to get a complete understanding of how iShare is. But here now I'm going to talk about um, the iFortrust data spaces, basically what we bring in iFortrust. What we say is, um, what iShare and Fiverr brings together in this iForTrust initiative, which helps you to quickly get started by to create your data space, right? Um, so iForTrust is basically a boilerplate for creating your data space. As you can see on the screen now, the open die building blocks, 12 building blocks with the 4 verticals, as I already explained to you. And you can see all the logos as well, where uh, you can see the technical building blocks or technology building blocks. They're all open source components available from Fiverr. And in the data sovereignty and trust, these components are made compliant with iShare specifications and framework. So you are ready to use them today, and use the iShare framework aspects with those components. Um, of course, and I already gave you a good understanding of data spaces governance, and also we provide you with the ready template for data space governance and the basic items in the business and operational agreements. So you can get started today with all that, and this all together acts as a boilerplate for creating your data space. um, that brings to basically also how would we define the role model in a data space, right? um, so in iForTrust, this is the role model that we define basically. In a data space, as I mentioned, there should be a trust provider, so it is the trust provider or the trust anchor, um, and the data consuming side, the data provider side, and the data owner basically together acts as the data exchange interested parties. And on the bottom you see the essential services, basically identity provider, authorization provider. And in iForTrust we also bring a very relevant service provisioning service called marketplace, which allows data owner, data provider to publish their data sets on the marketplace, and data consumer to find them in the marketplace, so it can procure rights to get access to that data. And um, this procurement is automatic, such that the marketplace itself creates a policy in the authorization registry for that data consumer once it has procured that. So that you will also learn in detail in the reference example. Again, that it is covered in the session on Friday. Um, but iForTrust role model, uh, all the components needed for this to play any of these roles are provided as open source components, which are compliant with iShare framework, as well as they are provided by Fiverr. So so they allow you to also do the data interoperability and data value creation at the same time. So this covers all blocks that are needed for any data space creation, right? So with this, under iForTrust, you get this as a ready-made solution or ready-made components that you can use to build your use case or solution in terms of that. Um, I'll Okay. The trust provider, I'll briefly explain what we mean by each role in iForTrust context, basically, and what do they fulfill. So in iForTrust data spaces, the trust provider or trust anchor, as we call now, essentially facilitates the trust between the participants of the data space, and also acting as a guardian within that data space. Um, this role is basically based on iShare satellite. So if you are implementing iForTrust data space, the iShare satellite of that data space is known as the trust provider in iForTrust role model context, right? We see that every data space should have minimum one trust provider. In an exceptional situation or exceptional data space, there can be more than one such role providers. Uh, but so far, we have not come across such a situation, but it can be possible theoretically. Um, IFA Trust, of course, exchange enables data sharing among parties, and these are the roles which are interested in data sharing. Of course, I explain data consumer, who consumes the data. In IFA Trust, this data consumer he connects to the context broker of the data provider to get the data normally, and basically data provider implements a context broker, fiber context broker, so that you use NGSI standard, NGSI LD standard, basically for exchange of data, and it is all connected to smart data models. So uh, uh, your data models are also defined within the smart data model initiative, which are then interoperable, as well as easily translatable to other smart data models. Data owners basically use authorization registries to give rights to the data consumer so that they can access the data directly from the source. Identity provider. Identity provider, as I explained, that is defined in iShare. Uh, is defined, or in iFortrust as well, is used for identifying human entities. Uh, uh, and this is all based on EIDAS framework. So the identity provider is onboarded with EIDAS framework. Um, it uses OpenID Connect flows, modified version of it based on iShare specification. Fireware brings Keyrock as an open source component, which is made compliant with this iShare specifications already. So if you implement this version of Keyrock, then technically you are compliant with the identity provider role of iShare. And this enables any organization to use your identity provider, um, provided that it is a registered identity provider in the network, for using it as an human identity provider, right? Authorizations provider role. As explained, authorizations registry provider is basically an endpoint where service providers can check for authorizations from data owner to data consumers. Um, and the authorization registry itself is responsible for its own implementation, and reference implementation is done in Keyrock, which is an open source Fiverr component, which allows you to store policies, which define the authorizations basically. And if you implement this open source component, technically you're compliant with authorization registry provider role. Of course, as an organization, you need to register as an authorization registry. Then there are additional requirements for you in terms of organizational requirements, basically. Marketplace, as I explained, marketplace allows data owners and data providers to publish their data sets which it wants to sell, basically, and data consumers, on the other hand, can buy or subscribe to these data sets using marketplace, right? um, uh, so the owner and the provider can actually register them as various kind of offerings under different financial models, or under different conditions, basically. And the consumer can choose whichever is more suitable for them to procure that data set. This is also again an open source component available from Fireware, uh, which is actually also compliant with TM Forum marketplace concepts, because Fireware is also involved there, and this marketplace is completely compliant and in line with those principles. Of course, there are additional services that can be added to any data space, or these are the roles that can be used in additional roles which are not defined in the framework, but they can be, of course, used within data spaces. Some examples are clearing houses, uh, data brokers, uh, a language vocabulary provider, etc., etc. So basically, these are additional third-party services which enables certain use cases in a better manner. So, for example, clearinghouse is basically nothing but like in banking world, when a data sharing transaction happens, and you want to bill per transaction of data sharing, then you need something of concept called clearing houses who can keep, as a third party, who can keep track of which transactions happen and what, with how much a charge should be done to which consumer, basically. That's an example. Data language vocabulary provider or data model translation provider are basically services which can translate data sets from one model to another. If needed, two data spaces could use this kind of service for interoperability purposes. Broker roles are there, which can make it easier for integrating multiple identity providers or authorization registries or data providers, basically. There are different kind of roles that are possible. These are some examples, but there are of course more roles possible, and they can all be added in the data space depending on their requirements. Now, in I for Trust, of course, you are not left out. But when you apply under I for Trust open call, and you win, your proposal is winning proposal, then you are taken through a 9-month customized mentoring program where you get complete support from I for Trust partners, basically. So iShare, Fireware, and Funding Box. Um, we help you during your implementation of your experiment. We allocate mentors to your project, so you have um, a regular touch point and contact point from our partners, basically, who are mentoring you throughout the implementation journey, also uh, helping you to upskill, basically, by referring you to all the trainings and the materials that we have. We provide all kinds of mentoring support in terms of legal, operational, technical, and business challenges that you may face. Um, Also, the ready building blocks that we provide and the open source components we provide, we also give you support in terms of that. And last but not least, very important, you also get funding, which is equity funding, as you saw, uh, for the selected experiment, depending on the size of your consortium. Um, yeah, and starting tomorrow for 3 days, we also have a cross value chain bootcamp where you have an opportunity to meet the experiments from the first open call, the 13 experiments. And here you can interact with them. You can ask for a dating session with them and find synergies, various kind of synergies. Either you want to use their solution, or you want to explore what additional opportunities are there in terms of next steps on what they are developing today. Um, Maybe you want to take the next step and bring one of the SMEs from the um current projects in the second open call that is running on, and whatnot. So you feel free to register yourself and make sure that you are there in this boot camp that is running for the next 3 days, basically, where you have opportunity to meet to other experiments and find synergies with them, basically. And that is it from my side for today. Now I will switch. Yeah. And yeah, feel free to shoot out any questions that you have.
Hi, Rajiv. We haven't received any questions yet. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A and the chat in case they come in. Perhaps just good to remind the participants where they will be able to access their recordings and the slides.
Yes. Yeah. So all these sessions of the trainings, they are always recorded and made available via our YouTube channel. So make sure you also subscribe to our YouTube channels, basically I for Trust channel. And of course, the slides will be published online as well. You can already find recordings and slides from previous sessions also via our website or via our GitHub, iFortress GitHub. And of course, this all the presentations that we do today and the recordings will also be shared there. So in a day or two, hopefully.